There is a version of World War II that most people know. It has a clear beginning and a clear end. It has sides that are easy to identify. It has a moral architecture that holds everything together, a framework where sacrifice meant something and where the outcome confirmed that the right side had won. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the parts that are missing were not left out by accident. The pieces that were removed, reclassified, buried in archive boxes, left out of official histories, or simply never spoken about again by the men who lived through them, those pieces tell a different story. Not a story about evil versus good, not a story about monsters versus heroes, a story about systems, about paperwork, about how a modern industrial civilization applied the same organizational logic it used to build highways and manage census data and process insurance claims to the business of killing on a continental scale, and how the people operating within those systems rarely thought of themselves as doing anything other than their jobs. The war did not happen because human beings became inhuman. It happened in large part because they remained entirely human, obedient, adaptive, capable of normalizing almost anything if the normalization happened gradually enough and came with sufficient institutional backing. That is the part that was told to be forgotten. Not because it was too painful, though it was, but because it was too clarifying. The first reality that veterans were told to forget, or never fully allowed to articulate, was this. The experience of combat was not primarily defined by heroism or fear or ideology. It was defined by fatigue and routine. The men who fought in the Pacific for months on end, who island-hopped through terrain that had no strategic or emotional meaning to them personally, who dug holes and waited and moved and dug more holes, described their experience not as a sustained confrontation with mortal danger, but as an overwhelming accumulation of small physical miseries: wet boots, bad food, dysentery, the weight of equipment, the inability to sleep, the endless waiting interrupted by brief periods of chaos that were followed immediately by more waiting. Combat itself, for most soldiers most of the time, lasted minutes. The surrounding architecture of military life, the logistics, the marching, the maintenance, the bureaucratic processing of one's own existence lasted months. Official accounts compressed those months into the minutes. The minutes became the story. The months, which is where the actual psychological damage occurred, became background. Soldiers who tried to explain this after the war found that their audiences were not interested. The culture had already decided what the war looked like. It looked like the minutes. The months were irrelevant. And so the men who came home carrying the weight of those months in their bodies and their behavior had no language that the culture was prepared to receive. They were handed a narrative that did not match their experience and were implicitly encouraged to retrofit their memories into that narrative or stay silent. Many chose silence. The second reality involves the structure of death as an administrative function. In the United States Army during World War II, the processing of casualties was a logistics operation. There were forms for it. There were units dedicated to it. The Graves Registration Service was a branch of the Quartermaster Corps, which also managed food supply and fuel. The organizational proximity was not accidental. Death, in the military framework, was a supply chain problem. Bodies needed to be located, identified, transported, documented, and stored. They needed to be tracked through a system. They needed paperwork. The men who worked in Graves registration processed thousands of bodies. They developed techniques. They learned how to work efficiently. They learned what the body looks like at various stages after death in various climates. They learned this not through any particular emotional investment, but through repetition. They did it every day. It became a job. And like all jobs performed repeatedly over long periods of time, it became routine. After the war, these men were not debriefed about what they had seen and done. They were not offered any particular support. They were discharged and told to go home. Many of them did go home. Many of them never spoke about what they had done. Not because the army told them specifically not to, though in some cases the nature of the work carried informal expectations of silence, but because there was no social vocabulary for it. There was no way to explain to a neighbor or a wife or a parent that you had spent 2 years handling the dead as an administrative task, that you had become very good at it, that it had stopped feeling like anything in particular. The third reality concerns the relationship between American soldiers and the civilian populations they moved through, both in Europe and the Pacific. The official narrative, the one that was promoted vigorously during and after the war, framed American forces as liberators. In many contexts, they were experienced that way. But the actual relationship between a military occupying force moving through foreign territory and the civilian population of that territory is never clean. And the American military's relationship with European and Pacific civilians was not clean either. In France, in Italy, in Germany after the collapse, American soldiers committed rapes. This is documented. It is not disputed by serious historians. It was documented at the time by military courts-martial, by reports filed within the army, by accounts collected by journalists and aid organizations. What happened with that documentation is instructive. Some cases were prosecuted. Many were not. The prosecutions that did occur disproportionately targeted Black American soldiers. White soldiers who committed identical crimes were significantly less likely to face legal consequences. The army knew this. The records showed it. The records were not widely distributed. The total number of sexual assaults committed by American forces in Western Europe during and after the war has been estimated by historians working with declassified records to number in the thousands. The official public narrative of American behavior in liberated Europe did not include this. It was not that the information was entirely suppressed. It existed in archives, in court records, in the testimony of survivors. It was that it was never incorporated into the story that was told publicly, repeatedly, and with institutional authority. The fourth reality is the firebombing. Not the atomic bombs, which became part of the public record almost immediately and have been debated at length ever since. The conventional firebombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities, which killed far more people in aggregate and which were conducted with full knowledge of their effects on civilian populations. The United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force together killed approximately 600,000 German civilians through aerial bombing during the war. The firestorms created over Hamburg in July 1943, over Dresden in February 1945, over dozens of other German cities were engineered. The physics of a firestorm, the conditions under which a concentration of incendiary bombs can create a self-sustaining column of superheated air that pulls oxygen toward itself and generates winds strong enough to pull people off the ground and into the fire, were understood by the planners. They were not incidental. They were, in a meaningful sense, the goal. In Japan, the firebombing campaign conducted by the 20th Air Force under General Curtis LeMay between March and August of 1945 killed somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000 civilians. The attack on Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night. That number is comparable to the immediate death toll of either atomic bombing. It received significantly less historical attention. LeMay understood what he was doing. He said in later years that if the United States had lost the war, he would have been tried as a war criminal. He said this not as a confession, but as a statement of fact, as an observation about how outcomes determine legal and moral categorization. He continued to be celebrated as a military hero for the rest of his life. The men who flew these missions were not told to think carefully about the civilians below. They were told to hit the target. Many of them knew what the targets were. Many of them did not allow themselves to think about it carefully, not because they were cruel, but because thinking about it carefully was not compatible with doing the job. This is one of the central mechanisms by which ordinary people participate in mass violence. The job is structured so that the person performing it does not have to hold the full picture in mind at any one time. Each individual act is small enough to be manageable. The aggregate is something that no individual person is required to confront. The fifth reality is the treatment of German prisoners of war by Allied forces. particularly in the period immediately following the German surrender in May 1945. This is one of the most carefully obscured chapters of the Allied military record. Eisenhower authorized the creation of a classification for captured German soldiers that removed them from the protections of the Geneva Convention. Instead of being classified as prisoners of war, which would have obligated the United States to meet specific standards of treatment, large numbers of German soldiers were classified as disarmed enemy forces. This reclassification was legal in the narrow technical sense that the United States Army created the category and applied it. It was a violation of the spirit and intent of the Geneva Conventions in a way that is difficult to argue around. The conditions in the camps established for disarmed enemy forces along the Rhine River in the spring and summer of 1945, the Rheinwiesenlager, have been the subject of significant historical controversy. German soldiers and civilians in these camps died of exposure, starvation, and disease. The estimates of deaths range from tens of thousands to several hundred thousand, depending on the methodology of the historian making the estimate. The United States military has never fully acknowledged the death toll. The official position has historically been that the numbers were much lower than critics have claimed. What is not disputed is that the reclassification was deliberate, that it was designed specifically to circumvent international law, and that it was approved at the highest levels of Allied military command. The legal mechanism and the bureaucratic logic were clear. The outcome was that men who would otherwise have been protected by international convention were placed in conditions that killed many of them. The sixth reality concerns the relationship between the United States government and the scientists and technical specialists of Nazi Germany after the war. Operation Paperclip, as it has come to be known, was a program through which the United States military and intelligence apparatus recruited, relocated, and employed hundreds of German scientists, many of whom had direct involvement in war crimes. Werner von Braun had been a member of the SS. The rockets he designed for the Nazi war machine were built using slave labor from concentration camps. Workers who were too weak to continue were killed. Von Braun was aware of these conditions. He visited the Mittelwerk facility where V-2 rockets were manufactured. He signed documents requesting the transfer of concentration camp inmates for use as labor. After the war, von Braun became a celebrated figure in American science and popular culture. He appeared on television. He was presented as a visionary. He led the team that built the rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon. The record of his wartime activities was classified, minimized, and officially managed for decades. He died, celebrated. He was not unique. Hundreds of German scientists with histories of involvement in forced labor, human experimentation, and weapons programs designed for the explicit purpose of killing civilian populations were absorbed into American government agencies, military research programs, and universities. Their records were scrubbed or reclassified. Their institutional affiliations were laundered through paperwork. The arrangement was not secret within the government. It required the cooperation of multiple agencies and was known at senior levels. It was simply not discussed publicly. The seventh reality involves the systematic looting of Europe. The scale of property theft conducted by Nazi Germany across occupied Europe during the war was enormous. Art, jewelry, gold, currency, household goods, business assets, real estate, the dispossession of Jewish and other minority populations was conducted through both violence and legal mechanism, often simultaneously. Laws were passed, transactions were recorded, bureaucracies processed the transfers. When the Allied forces moved through Europe and encountered this accumulated stolen property, the response was not uniform return to victims. Some restitution occurred, and some organizations made genuine efforts to identify and return stolen property. But large quantities of looted gold, currency, and other assets moved in various directions through various hands at the end of the war, and the tracking of that movement was not comprehensive. The post-war settlement of property claims was systematically skewed against the populations who had been most aggressively dispossessed. Jewish survivors, attempting to reclaim property in Germany, in Austria, in France, in the Netherlands, encountered bureaucracies that were frequently staffed by the same people who had managed the dispossession and who now managed the claims processes. Courts demanded documentation that the dispossession had been specifically designed to eliminate. Statutes of limitations ran out. Properties had passed through multiple hands and acquired legal complexity that made restoration practically impossible. This process continued for decades. Major restitution agreements were still being negotiated and litigated into the 21st century, more than 50 years after the war ended. The eighth reality concerns the use of chemical agents by all major powers during the conflict, not in combat, which did not occur on a large scale, but in research, in preparation, and in accidents that were then concealed. In December 1943, German aircraft bombed Allied ships in the harbor at Bari, in southern Italy. Among the ships struck was the SS John Harvey, an American vessel carrying a secret cargo of mustard gas bombs, approximately 100 tons of sulfur mustard, which the Allied command had positioned in the Mediterranean theater as a retaliatory deterrent. The explosion and subsequent leakage of mustard gas killed an estimated 1,000 Allied servicemen and an unknown number of Italian civilians. The incident was classified by the Allied command. Survivors were treated, but medical personnel were not informed of the cause of their patients' injuries, and in some cases were actively misled about the nature of the casualties they were treating. This contributed directly to preventable deaths, as the treatment protocol for mustard gas exposure is specific and was not administered because the true cause was concealed. The official record of the Bari disaster remained classified for decades. Survivors who developed long-term health conditions related to mustard gas exposure were denied service-related benefits because the cause of their injuries was not acknowledged. The classification served no continuing military purpose after the war. It served the purpose of avoiding accountability. The ninth reality involves the experience of Black American soldiers within the racially segregated United States military and the particular violence visited upon them when they returned home. Black Americans served in a military that was explicitly and legally segregated for the duration of the war. They were assigned to separate units, housed in separate facilities, served in separate mess halls, and were subject to a formal organizational hierarchy that reflected and enforced the racial caste system of American civilian society. They were deployed to fight for a country that denied them basic legal and civic equality, and they knew this, and many of them enlisted anyway, for reasons that were varied and complex, and were rarely asked about by the white military establishment or the white press. When these men returned from the war, they returned to a society that had decided the war had been about freedom and democracy, and they returned to communities where the freedom and democracy for which they had been told they fought were explicitly withheld from them. The particular brutality of this was not accidental or incidental. The violence visited upon returning black veterans, the lynchings, the attacks, the systematic denial of GI Bill benefits through discriminatory lending and educational practices was in part a direct response to the fact that military service had given black men access to weapons, training, organizational capability, and a claim to equal citizenship that the existing racial order could not accommodate. In 1946, Isaac Woodard, a black Army sergeant, was pulled off a bus in South Carolina by local police hours after receiving his honorable discharge from the Army. He was beaten so severely that he was permanently blinded in both eyes. The officer responsible was tried in federal court and acquitted by an all-white jury in under 30 minutes. The acquittal was greeted with laughter in the courtroom. The 10th reality is the Nuremberg framework itself, and the specific decisions about what it would and would not prosecute. The Nuremberg trials established a legal precedent of enormous importance. The prosecution of Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, for crimes against peace, for genocide. This was genuinely new in international law, and its establishment was a real institutional achievement. What is less often discussed is the way in which the structure of the prosecution was deliberately designed to exclude conduct that would have implicated the Allied powers. The charge of waging aggressive war was applied to German leaders for the invasion of Poland. It was not applied to the Allied powers for actions that would have met a similar definitional standard under a neutral reading of the same legal principles. The bombing of civilian populations was not prosecuted as a war crime, even though the prosecution team included evidence of deliberate German bombing of civilian areas. The precedent that might have applied to the Allied bombing campaigns was carefully avoided. The Soviet Union, which had its own record of mass atrocities both before and during the war, sat as a judge at Nuremberg. Soviet prosecutors participated in the proceedings. The Katyn Forest massacre, in which Soviet forces killed approximately 22,000 Polish military officers, police and intellectuals in 1940, was actually attributed to Germany during the Nuremberg proceedings. The Soviet delegation introduced it as evidence of German atrocity. This was a deliberate fabrication at a tribunal explicitly convened to establish truth and accountability. The Soviets had killed those men. The Germans were charged with it at Nuremberg. The charge was ultimately dropped, but the episode indicates the nature of the institution as a partially political construction, not a purely juridical one. The 11th reality concerns what happened to the populations of Eastern Europe under Soviet occupation, which was occurring simultaneously with the Allied campaign against Nazi Germany, and which the Western Allied powers were aware of, and had concluded they could not challenge without creating a political rupture that would compromise the war effort. Soviet behavior in occupied Eastern European territories followed patterns that were, in their bureaucratic and systematic character, structurally parallel to Nazi behavior, though distinct in their stated ideological justification and in some of their specific methods. Mass deportations of civilian populations were conducted on ethnic and political grounds. Summary executions were carried out by special units operating under institutional authorization. Populations deemed politically unreliable were removed from their communities and relocated to conditions in which many of them died. The Western Allied powers knew about this. Intelligence services collected information. Diplomatic communications reflected awareness. The political decision made was that prosecuting the war against Germany required Soviet cooperation, and that Soviet cooperation required not pressing publicly or institutionally on Soviet conduct. This was a rational calculation given the strategic situation. It was also a decision to accept the ongoing atrocity as an operating condition of the alliance. After the war, the populations of Eastern Europe were enclosed within the Soviet sphere under conditions that the Western Allied powers had explicitly agreed to at Yalta and Potsdam. The people who had been liberated from Nazi occupation in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were transferred directly into Soviet occupation. This is not a historical secret. It is simply not a prominent part of the narrative of the war, as it is typically presented in Western countries, because that narrative is built around the idea that the war ended with freedom, and this part of the outcome does not fit that structure. The 12th reality involves the Japanese Americans who were imprisoned in internment camps within the United States during the war. This story is more widely known than some of the others in this accounting, but its specific features are worth examining carefully because they illustrate the relationship between legal mechanism and mass harm. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of approximately 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the west coast of the United States. About 2/3 of them were American citizens. They were given days to dispose of their property and businesses and homes. They were transported to camps in remote areas and held for years without individual charges or hearings. The action was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States in Korematsu v. United States in 1944. The legal mechanism functioned exactly as it was designed to function. The courts confirmed that the executive authority to do this existed. The bureaucracy processed the transfers. The camps operated according to regulations. The people imprisoned in these camps lost property that was never returned. They lost businesses that did not survive. They lost years. They lived in conditions of institutional confinement, enforced by armed guards. Many of the men imprisoned in these camps simultaneously had family members serving in the United States military and the European theater, including in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, one of the most decorated units in American military history, composed almost entirely of Japanese-American soldiers whose families were imprisoned at home. The legal vindication of the internment lasted until 1988, when Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act offering a formal apology and modest reparations. The Supreme Court decision in Korematsu was not formally overruled until 2018, 74 years after it was issued. The 13th reality concerns the Allied strategic bombing campaign in terms of its effects on civilian labor populations, specifically in Germany. The bombing campaign was explicitly designed not only to destroy industrial capacity, but to break civilian morale, and its conduct was known internally to produce contradictory results. British and American Air Force analysts collected and processed data throughout the war on the effect of bombing on German industrial output and on German civilian morale. The data collected showed consistently that bombing German cities did not destroy civilian morale in the way that had been theorized. German industrial production actually increased in some sectors through 1944, despite sustained bombing, in part because the bombing forced a dispersal and decentralization of industrial facilities that in some respects made production more resilient. The morale data showed that German civilians under sustained bombing did not turn against their government in the ways that the strategic bombing theory had predicted. Instead, the evidence suggested that sustained bombing had the effect of intensifying social cohesion and compliance with the existing authority structure. This data existed. It was collected by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a massive analytical enterprise that deployed hundreds of analysts and economists to Germany after the war to assess the effect of the bombing campaign. The survey's findings were broadly available within government circles. They presented a significant challenge to the strategic rationale for area bombing of civilian targets. They did not substantially alter the retrospective presentation of the bombing campaign, which continued to be defended as a legitimate and effective strategy. The 14th reality is the experience of the men who operated and maintained the atomic bomb program, specifically the people who loaded the bombs onto the aircraft at Tinian Island in the Pacific, who worked in the assembly facilities, who were aware of what the weapon was and what it was designed to do, and who had no institutional channel through which to raise any concern. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japanese cities was made at a political and military level, entirely removed from the men who loaded and delivered them. Those men did their jobs. They were soldiers. The organizational structure required no discussion and offered no opportunity for it. The ethical weight of the decision, if it was experienced as having ethical weight by those who made it, was carried by people who were not present at the delivery. The bombardier on the Enola Gay, Thomas Ferriby, released the first atomic bomb used in warfare at 8:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945. He did it by performing the same mechanical sequence he had performed hundreds of times on hundreds of missions. He was very good at it. The precision of the delivery was a function of his professional competence, practiced to the level where it required no particular conscious engagement with the nature of what he was releasing. He did the job he had been trained to do. The result was that approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people died within the first seconds or minutes of the explosion, and an equivalent number died in the following weeks and months from blast injury, burns, and radiation. Ferriby lived until 2000. He gave interviews in his later years. He did not express substantial regret. The 15th reality concerns the treatment of surrendering Japanese soldiers by American forces and the cultural and institutional conditions under which battlefield killing of prisoners occurred. Combat in the Pacific Theater was characterized by a level of mutual dehumanization between American and Japanese forces that was substantially more intense and explicitly racial in character than the conditions that prevailed in the European theater. American military and political leadership from early in the Pacific War had adopted and distributed propaganda materials presenting Japanese soldiers as subhuman, as animals, as creatures fundamentally different from white Western men in their psychology and their relationship to pain, death, and rational decision-making. This framing was not incidental. It was deliberate. It served the purpose of making it easier for American soldiers to kill Japanese soldiers, and to some extent, it worked. The practical consequence was that the conventions of war, the acceptance of surrender, the protection of prisoners, were significantly less observed in the Pacific than in Europe. Japanese soldiers who attempted to surrender were frequently killed rather than taken prisoner. American soldiers collected the teeth, the skulls, and the other bones of Japanese dead as trophies in ways that had no parallel in the European theater. And this behavior was sufficiently widespread to be documented in contemporary photographs and discussed in wartime publications, including American newspapers, without apparent public alarm. American Admiral William Halsey said in a 1944 interview that he wanted to kill so many Japanese that Japanese mothers would use the name as a threat to quiet their children. He said this as a statement of command philosophy. It was published. The publication provoked no institutional response. The collection of Japanese skulls and bones by American soldiers was noted by President Roosevelt himself, who received a letter opener made from the arm bone of a Japanese soldier as a gift from a congressman in 1944. The gift was reported on by American journalists. It caused brief commentary and was then forgotten. The 16th reality is the scope of what occurred in China during the war, specifically the Japanese occupation and the conduct of the Japanese military on the Chinese mainland, and the degree to which the full accounting of that conduct was constrained by the post-war political arrangements in East Asia. The Japanese military conducted operations on the Chinese mainland that included the systematic killing of civilian populations on a scale that historians estimate in the millions. The Nanjing Massacre, which occurred in December 1937 and the months following, resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war in a single city over a period of weeks. These killings were not incidental or the result of poor discipline. They were conducted systematically in front of witnesses, photographed and reported on at the time. The post-war accounting for these crimes was constrained by the specific political circumstances of East Asia after 1945. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo trial's equivalent of Nuremberg, prosecuted a smaller number of cases and produced outcomes that many legal scholars have considered less rigorous than the European proceedings. Emperor Hirohito, who had authorized the war and whose name had been invoked in every command structure of the Japanese military, was not prosecuted. This decision was made by the American Occupation Authority under General Douglas MacArthur, for reasons that were primarily political. The judgment that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize the occupation and make the transition to a post-war Japan aligned with American strategic interests more difficult. Japanese scientists who had conducted lethal human experimentation through Unit 731 and related programs were given immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data. This arrangement was made specifically and intentionally. American biological weapons researchers wanted the data. The data had been produced through the systematic torture and killing of prisoners, primarily Chinese, Korean, and Russian civilians. The exchange was negotiated. The data was transferred. The scientists were protected. The 17th reality concerns the French experience of the occupation and collaboration, and the specific way in which the post-war French national narrative was constructed to paper over what had actually occurred. The Vichy government, which administered French territory under German occupation from 1940 to 1944, was not a puppet regime operating under direct German compulsion in most of its functions. It was a French government, staffed by French people, operating according to French bureaucratic procedures, which made independent decisions to collaborate with and in many cases anticipate German demands. The Rafle du Vel d'Archives, in July 1942, in which approximately 13,000 Jewish people, including more than 4,000 children, were arrested by French police, transported to a cycling arena, held in catastrophic conditions, and then transferred to German custody for deportation to Auschwitz, was organized and carried out by French authorities. German involvement was limited to providing the destination. The arrests, the transportation, the administration of the assembly point, these were French operations. After the liberation in 1944, the myth of French resistance and universal opposition to the occupation was constructed rapidly and with institutional support. Charles de Gaulle was a primary architect of this narrative. The Gaullist version of the occupation held that France had been oppressed by Germany and had largely resisted, with a small number of traitors who would be dealt with through the purge. The purge, the epuration, killed somewhere between 10,000 and 40,000 people, some of them genuine collaborators and some of them victims of local vendettas unrelated to the war. What the Gaullist narrative did not accommodate was the deep extent of ordinary French participation in the machinery of occupation, the bureaucrats who processed the deportation lists, the police who carried out the arrests, the neighbors who provided information, the businesses that continued to operate and profit under occupation conditions. This was not a small number of traitors. It was a substantial portion of French society functioning within the systems available to it. The French national accounting for this period was substantially incomplete until the 1990s, when President Jacques Chirac became the first French head of state to formally acknowledge that the French state had participated in the persecution of Jewish people during the occupation. This was 50 years after the events in question. The 18th reality involves the conditions in which American strategic planners approached the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands, which was being actively planned in the summer of 1945, and what those plans revealed about the institutional relationship between military planning and civilian casualty projections. Operation Downfall, the planned Allied invasion of Japan consisting of Operations Olympic and Coronet, was accompanied by casualty estimates that were integrated into the planning process as data points to be managed rather than as moral considerations to be weighed. American military planners estimated American casualties in the hundreds of thousands. Japanese military and civilian casualty estimates were also prepared, and they were very large, in the millions. Japanese civilian populations had been incorporated into the defensive planning by Japanese military command. Women were being organized into militia units armed with bamboo spears. Children were participating in civil defense drills designed to respond to ground invasion. The Japanese military planned to use kamikaze tactics against the invasion fleet on a massive scale, had been accumulating aircraft for this purpose, and had positioned significant conventional forces in the projected landing areas. The planning documents for Downfall were matter of fact. They processed the projected deaths of large numbers of people through a logistics framework. The questions they addressed were about supply chains and troop rotations and medical capacity. The question of whether the projected civilian deaths were acceptable was not a question that appeared as such in the planning documents, because it was not a planning document kind of question. That was a different level of decision made by a different set of people, and the planner's job was to plan the operation given the decision that had been made. This division of moral labor, the separation of the decision from the execution, the isolation of the planners from the decision-makers, the isolation of the soldiers from the planners, is one of the structural features that allowed the war to be conducted at the scale it was. Each component of the killing machinery operated in a defined domain. No individual was required to hold the full picture. The 19th reality concerns the specific mechanics of the Holocaust as an administrative operation, not its horror, which is well documented, but the specific way in which its administrative character has been systematically underemphasized in its popular presentation. The genocide of European Jewish people and other targeted populations during the war was administered through the normal German bureaucratic apparatus. It had a budget line. It had personnel records. It had interdepartmental communications. The deportations were coordinated with the German railway system, the Reichsbahn, which issued timetables and billing invoices for the transportation of prisoners to the camps. The Reichsbahn charged the SS for prisoner transport at the normal third-class passenger rate, one-way tickets only. The camps themselves maintained detailed records. Prisoner intake was documented. Deaths were recorded, sometimes accurately and sometimes through euphemism, but documented. The administrative infrastructure required to process millions of people through this system over several years was substantial. It required the ongoing active participation of large numbers of ordinary employees of the German state and German industry. The companies that built and supplied the camps, the companies that manufactured the gas used in the killing facilities, the companies that built the crematoria, continued to exist after the war. Many of them retained the same management and the same workforce. Some of them were prosecuted, most were not. Several became, in the post-war period, large and successful enterprises. The specific way in which the genocide was enabled by bureaucratic normalization, by the progressive escalation from discriminatory laws to property seizure, to forced labor to systematic killing, each step naturalized before the next was introduced, was identified by Hannah Arendt in her reporting on the Eichmann trial in 1961 and was not well received in all quarters. The idea that the genocide was a bureaucratic phenomenon as much as an ideological one, that its perpetrators were not primarily monsters but primarily workers, was disturbing in ways that pure monstrousness was not, because it raised different questions about what ordinary people were capable of under ordinary institutional conditions. Adolf Eichmann was not a sadist. He was not a killer in the direct physical sense. He was a logistics specialist. He was very good at coordinating the transport of large populations through a complex network. He applied this skill to the Holocaust. He considered his work to be professional work. He brought to it the same orientation toward competence and completion that a person brings to any demanding administrative task. The 20th reality involves the long-term health consequences experienced by American soldiers who participated in atomic tests after the war, and the specific way in which the military and government managed the documentation and compensation of those consequences. Between 1945 and 1962, the United States conducted hundreds of atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. Many of these tests were conducted with American military personnel deliberately positioned in close proximity to the explosions, as observers, as participants in exercises designed to evaluate the psychological and tactical impact of nuclear weapons on soldiers, as subjects in studies examining radiation exposure effects. These men were ordered to be there. They were not, in most cases, given meaningful information about what they were being exposed to or what the health effects might be. They were ordered to positions, and they took those positions because they were soldiers, and those were their orders. In the decades following these tests, these men developed cancers and other radiation-related illnesses at elevated rates. They attempted to file claims for service-related disability compensation. The Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission denied or minimized these claims for decades, disputing the connection between radiation exposure and illness, reclassifying records relevant to dose exposure, and in some cases actively contesting the testimony of the men themselves about what they had been ordered to do and where they had been positioned. The Radiation Exposed Veterans Compensation Act was passed by Congress in 1988, acknowledging the connection between nuclear testing participation and certain cancers. It came decades after the exposure, and for many of the men who had been exposed, it came after their deaths. The 21st reality concerns the Japanese internment of Allied prisoners of war and the conditions of those camps, which were brutal and which resulted in very high death rates among prisoners, particularly in the Pacific Theater. This is relatively well known. What is less discussed is the specific decision-making about how to handle these camps as the Pacific War came to an end and the Allied forces prepared for what they expected to be the invasion of Japan. Allied military planners preparing for the invasion developed intelligence on the locations of prisoner-of-war camps across the Japanese home islands and in Japanese-controlled territory. Within this intelligence analysis was an assessment of what would happen to those prisoners if the invasion proceeded. The assessment, based on captured Japanese documents including orders found on Japanese officers killed in the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns, was that standing orders existed for the execution of all Allied prisoners in the event of an Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. This assessment was accurate. The orders existed. They were issued by the Japanese military command. Allied prisoners who survived the war and were liberated from camps in Japan and its territories after the surrender have confirmed that camp guards had received orders for prisoner execution prior to the surrender announcement, and that some guards had made preparations to carry out those orders. The existence of these orders and the assessment of their likely execution were factors in the decision-making process about how to end the war in the Pacific. This does not settle the moral calculation about the atomic bombs, which remains genuinely contested by serious historians and ethicists. It does indicate that the decision-making process was more complex and that the considerations involved were more concrete and specific than is often represented in popular accounts that frame the decision primarily as a binary choice between bombs and invasion. The 22nd reality involves the German population's relationship to knowledge of the genocide occurring within and adjacent to their borders, which is a question that has been studied systematically by historians and which produces results more uncomfortable than the standard narrative accommodates. The standard narrative, as it was established in the early post-war period, largely through the mechanism of denazification and the political need to reconstitute a German state as a Western ally, held that ordinary German civilians did not know about the genocide. That knowledge was confined to the SS and the specialized personnel of the camp system, and that the German population was in a meaningful sense a second victim of the Nazi regime. The historical research conducted since the 1980s, building on earlier work and incorporating demographic data, logistical analysis, testimony collections, and documentary evidence, has produced a substantially different picture. The genocide required the participation of very large numbers of ordinary Germans in roles that were not confined to specialized units. The deportations of Jewish populations from German cities were conducted in the open, on public streets and at public transit stations, in the presence of civilian bystanders. The military and police units that conducted mass shootings on the Eastern Front were not special formations. They were regular police and military units whose members rotated in and out of regular assignments. Letters and diaries from the Eastern Front describe what soldiers witnessed and participated in. Photographs were taken and in some cases shared with families at home. The knowledge was not universal. The specific organizational details of the camp system were not widely understood. But the fact that the Jewish population of Germany and German-occupied territories was being systematically removed and killed was not a secret concealed from the German public, so much as it was a fact that the German public was able to decline to engage with actively. The mechanisms of willful ignorance, the disinclination to ask questions whose answers one does not want, the social pressure to maintain normalcy, the rationalization of incomplete information, were extensively in operation. This distinction matters because it affects the analysis of how ordinary populations can coexist with ongoing atrocity without the atrocity being unknown to them. The 23rd reality is this: the war ended. The specific mechanisms and systems and institutional arrangements that had enabled the war's conduct, the bureaucratic processing of death, the administrative management of populations, the application of industrial logic to mass violence, the legal frameworks that permitted the deliberate killing of civilian populations from the air, the structures of racial hierarchy that determined whose suffering was counted and whose was not, the organizational protocols that separated individual acts from systemic outcomes and thereby distributed moral responsibility to the point of invisibility. These did not end with the armistice. They were in many cases transferred. They were reclassified. They were rehabilitated and applied to new purposes in a new political context. The scientists were employed. The methods were studied. The legal precedents were selectively retained. The intelligence assets were protected and reactivated. The institutional knowledge of how to manage populations at scale, how to process human beings through administrative systems as logistical problems to be solved, how to maintain the ordinary functioning of bureaucracies engaged in extraordinary harm. This knowledge did not disappear in 1945. The men who had performed these functions took them home. Most of them went back to civilian jobs. They had mortgages and cars and children who grew up in the post-war prosperity. The specific technical and psychological knowledge of how to participate in mass violence within an institutional framework, how to perform one's role efficiently and without undue self-reflection, how to operate within a system whose aggregate purpose one may or may not have been permitted to see clearly. This knowledge sat in those men, mostly unused, mostly unspoken, carried quietly through their ordinary post-war lives until they died. The war was over. The systems that had run it were not dismantled. They were inherited.